Thank you so much for the generous invitation. And well, I have my Oscar speech here, so I'll get to it in just a minute. But I do want to say that I'm actually accepting this on behalf of Katya Hirschman, Albert's last surviving direct relative. And we'll have a photograph of her shortly. But she wishes she could be here. She's in France. But she's enormously grateful for this award. Let me just make sure I'm running this right. So if I hit here, there we are. Okay. Well, yes, there's a compressed version of a life, and of course I realize that there's a slide that should follow this, or this slide should have been a little longer because there are more books and articles to come at the bottom end. So I haven't covered it all here. The loss of Albert Hirschman was, of course, coming for many years. He was ill, seriously ill, but it was nonetheless a shock to us all. And you know, on his behalf and the family's behalf, just want to acknowledge the thank you for the honor. He was, and there's a reason why we're here, one of the most original social scientists of the 20th century. He was also, for a number of years, as you're going to see right here, a colleague of Leontief's. And they were fellow travelers, if I can use those words, and involved in what turned out to be a moment of great upheaval within the economics department at Harvard, and the two of them were on one side of the upheaval, and they both left more or less simultaneously, in part in response to what happened there. I suppose I don't have to rehearse that story. Maybe for younger people, you can Google what happened to the Harvard economics department in the early 1970s, but it was, in a sense, an opening up of the rift within the economics, the discipline of economics. Well, this is Albert Hirschman in the middle of the 1980s. Rather than talk about his work, I thought I would say just a few words about his life, and then share with you some ideas about the relationship between the life and the work. As a biographer, that is what I set out to try to do. And to ask the question what the relationship was between a lived experience and the work that we know, that we reread and over and over again and write books in response. I was just talking to Katrina Burgess about this, why we keep going back to so much of the Hirschman oeuvre as a point of reference. This turned out to be a more difficult challenge than I thought when I embarked on the Hirschman Odyssey. It was an odyssey for me too, in part because he was a very reserved man. He was very reserved with his students, as we got yet another testimony this afternoon. He was very reserved with his colleagues. When I interviewed those who were still alive, none of them could recall him ever saying a word during any of the faculty meetings. They were, from the chair's perspective, I was chair of several departments for many years. This is sometimes very welcome. But he was, for all of his theorizing of voice, he actually didn't articulate much, and he didn't articulate much with me. I'm planting seeds now for the Q&A if you want. One of the reasons why that was because some of the memories of the past were very uncomfortable for him. He was always a resolutely optimistic man. Didn't make him mindlessly optimistic, but he was always trying to find silver linings in dark clouds, which is going to become a theme of some of the things I talk about in a bit. But he did not want to talk about some dark chapters of the past, which is what I'm going to talk about with you. And so it raised all kinds of methodological problems for a biographer. How do you talk about the gaps, the absences, the lapse, the unknowns, the ambiguities, if your subject isn't going to help you sort some of that out? And part of it you can get through epistolary sources, letters that he wrote, and I will talk about one of the letters, journal, diary entries, and at the very end of her life, Sarah gave me, his wife gave me his notebooks of his many travels that helped fill some of this in. As I looked around at other works that tackled the life of writers, I realized that literary biographers patch and fill all the time. And the next time you read a literary biography, like try Hermione Lee, in my view, probably the best biographer on the planet right now, colleague of Francis's at Oxford, read her biography of Virginia Woolf, for instance. And one of the things that literary biographers often do, and it's a very effective device, is to use the novels or the short stories characters as if they were props also in the lived experience of the subject about whom you are writing, and weaving back and forth then between the lived experience and the characters of the novels. Well, what do you do when your subject doesn't write fiction? Although I know a lot of economists thought that Albert Hirschman was a fiction writer. His most important source was always Flaubert, actually. And so the absence of math, in a sense, was made up by the incredible prominence, particularly of French literature. But if you don't have the drama, if you don't have the characters of the novels who can speak to the inner life of the subject, what do you do? Well, thankfully, Hirschman was a prodigious concept builder. His famous turns of phrases, his words, his metaphors, in a sense, serve a function in the same way that the dramatis persona of a novel can serve for a biographer. So let me use one of his most famous formula, and I'm glad that you brought out exit, voice, and loyalty here, because I'm going to use those words. That famous formulation from the book that he published in 1970, part of which was written here in Boston. So exit, voice, and loyalty. Hirschman's life was a life of many exits. He was born in Berlin in 1915. Here you have a photograph of him. He's 9 years old, the son of a bourgeois assimilated Jewish family. His father was a very successful surgeon, and grew up during the age of the Weimar Republic, in a sense the era of great tolerance and eventually, of course, instability. And you can see in his early life in Berlin the ways in which, as a product of the Weimar Republic, he himself remained thereafter ever loyal to the principles that the Weimar Republic were, in a sense, represented. Tolerance, open to new ideas and new influences, deeply cosmopolitan, as he and his family were. While loyal to the principles of the Republic, and in part because of his loyalty to the Republic, at a very young age, at 16, he became a militant in the Socialist Party in Germany, and in the very feverish years of 1932-33, when Hitler was coming to power, he became very actively involved as a student, first in his gymnasium. He studied at the French gymnasium, and then at the University of Berlin, where Leontief also studied. Leontief was a little bit older than Hirschman. Very actively involved in the struggle against the rise of Nazism. That, of course, as we all know, did not, it was not a successful venture. And Hirschman was forced to flee to France in April 1933 for a number of reasons. I can go into those in Q&A if you want. This is a photograph of him with his sister in Normandy. That's Albert, and that's Ursula, his sister, who's a year and a half older than him, a very influential feminist activist in Europe. She then became an Italian and very involved in European federalism. And so we get Hirschman's first exit. Exit, in a sense, in response to the impossibility of voice. in the defense of the principles of the Weimar Republic. And from 33 onwards, Hirschman has, as many people did of that generation, a peripatetic life. He moved around Europe, years in France. He studied in England for a year, went to the LSE, paid no attention to the dust-up over the general theory, which was published in while he was a student there in 35, 36. And of course, the LSE was the bastion of the debate between Keynesians and the combination of Lionel Robbins and Friedrich Hayek, and I'll get to Hayek in just a minute. And thereafter went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. From Spain, then went to Italy and joined the Italian underground. Along the way, he earned a doctorate. So all you graduate students out there, you should be envious that you can be involved in the underground and get a PhD at the same time. Times were different back then, so you don't have to feel overly burdened by these things. And then moved back after the anti-Semitic decrees in September of 1938, had to leave Italy once more, yet another exit, and moved back to France. And when, actually just before the war broke out, he joined the French army. And the French army, of course, collapsed in just a matter of months of the Nazi invasion. Hirschman, then, so you have to imagine a Jew, a German, fighting for the French army against a German army, the danger that he was in. He bicycled to Marseilles. Here we have a photograph of him in 1940. From July to December of 1940, he was involved in an operation rescue run by an American called Varian Fry. This is Hirschman here. So it's a 25-year-old man who now speaks many languages, has a PhD from the University of Trieste. And what he's doing in this photograph is preparing a refugee to cross the Pyrenees to escape eventually to Lisbon and then hopefully catch a boat on to the New World to get out of Europe. And he ran then an operation with Varian Fry that got thousands of refugees out of Europe. So here we see right now, and we can go into details in the Q&A if you want about that whole operation and how he ran it. But we have a problem. Exit, voice, and loyalty, these are all the same thing. They're coiled together. That book, which people often afterwards read as positioning people as having to make choices between exit, voice, or loyalty, Hirschman actually was inviting us to think about the ways in which we're always combining all three. That we are mixing and amalgamating different strategies at the same time. He was always very sensitive to the need to think in complex ways about human behavior and the consequences, often at odds with the way in which the social sciences were favoring more and more parsimony. And he has a very illuminating essay as a critique of parsimony as a value or a norm in the social sciences. And so, and there's disclosure mode as the author of a biography, trying to use his own categories, quickly finding that the categories soon bleed into each other. And so how useful was this really? How difficult it was to separate voice from loyalty. And of course, it was a source of a great deal of anguish for him too, as it would culminate in the end in his own exit once the police chased him down and he once again escaped arrest and himself became one of the refugees and moved to the United States. But of course, there was still a struggle. Again, blending exit, voice, and loyalty, though Hirschman would set up camp in Berkeley, where he would write his first book and meet his wife, Sarah, his companion for life. No sooner did the United States join the war than he joined the U.S. Army. In fact, it's remarkable how little time he let lapse before he signed up. Here he is in training at Camp Roberts. He was always criticized by his superior officers for never being able to tie his bootlaces properly. His real fantasy, though, was to join a fledgling organization called the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. Vasily Leontief also worked for the OSS, although in the analysis branch, it's called the RA, the Research and Analysis Branch of the OSS. Again, we can talk about that more if you want. Hirschman wanted to be part of this brain trust in the intelligence services running the war, and instead was dispatched to the Italian campaign and fought in that really awful chapter of the Second World War as a private for the Office of Strategic Services. He had wanted to engage his intellectual skills with what OSS was doing. He was an expert in the European economies, particularly how fascist economies worked. But there was a cloud of suspicion hanging over him. And in the course of the research for the book, I finally got the FBI file on him declassified, and it was very revealing on how the FBI changed the course of his life without him ever realizing it. Talk about invisible hands. Okay, I've not said anything about his intellectual achievements. But since this award is in part a recognition for his contribution to development thinking, I figured I would share with you a sense of how did his voyage start. And it will eventually lead to development because going to the United States was not, in fact, the last of his exits. The last of his exits when he was forced to leave the United States in 1952 as he was hounded by the McCarthyite purges of the Federal Civil Service, where he was working for the Federal Reserve Board, and he flees to Colombia. And this is where the story intersects with Francis's. So this photo is for Francis. Here's the Hirschman family. This is Katya saying hello to everybody. Thank you for the award. Lisa, who died a number of years ago, and Sarah, who died last year, and that's Albert. This photograph is taken in the highlands of Colombia, and it is in Colombia that Hirschman will reinvent himself as a development economist. He has been working on European reconstruction issues for the Fed, but in his exile, watched development in action. And when he resurfaced from Colombia, he encountered North American economists working on development economics, writing in very abstract ways and formula about development, and said, but that's not what's happening on the ground. And thereafter, Hirschman always remained a devout observer of development to build concepts about it, rather than starting with some abstract theories, and he was always a skeptic of abstract theories from the time of the infighting that he as a socialist had with Marxists on the left and reactionaries on the right, who operated with very large views of how the world should function. He wanted to look at how the world functioned in reality. And so you can see the pendular activity that goes on between being engaged in the world, observing the world, and developing concepts and theories about the world, and then testing them once again against reality. And so it was his involvement in the rural world, particularly of Latin America, that really lay behind the first major work that he'll write in development economics called The Strategy of Economic Development, which we published in 1958, which, though you can't see the traces of it when you read that book, has Colombia and the life that he and his family had there stamped all over it. Let me end with two more images, again, about the field, about what it means to observe the world, to be engaged in it. Many years later, a quarter of a century later, he and Sarah, so this is Albert, much older, with Sarah, in the Dominican Republic in 1983. Here's another photograph from a project that he was involved in that got almost no recognition. I mean, Francis could tell us perhaps whether getting ahead collectively had any impact on development economics. It was a very small book written as a supplement for Paul Streeton for the magazine journal called World Development. And what Hirschman was trying to do in that work, by observing how poor people organized their lives collectively to improve them, in a sense represented his efforts to look for alternatives and possibilities, even in dark times. So this was a very dark period in Latin American history, in the middle of the debt crisis. Hirschman was saying, poor people are working hard to solve their problems. At the height of his influence, he would leave the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and go off into the field. But it was not just that the poor were actively involved in improving their own lives, but that they were doing it collectively. That was the key word of that book. Searching for clues in everyday life to reveal surprising, even heroic stories, often in the face of great adversity. So, once again, on behalf of the family, let me thank the members of the Leontief Award Committee and the Tufts community for bestowing the prize on Albert Hirschman. Thank you.